Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Kylie Adair. My pronouns are she and her, and I work as the editor of Future of Good. I'm joining this call today from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Although I actually did just move to Tiohtià:ke, colonially known as Montreal. So my work moving forward really is to sort of get learning about the original stewards of that land and the present day relationships the land has to its original stewards. So today we're all gathered here to talk about inflation. Future of Good reporter Shannon VanRaes is here with me, and I'm actually just going to pin her to the screen, which I meant to do earlier. And there we go. So we are talking about a huge body of work that Shannon has done over the past several months. She spent a lot of her time here with Future of Good, really focused on reporting on inflation. So how inflation and the cost of living crisis have impacted community organizations and the people that they serve. So I'm going to drop the link actually in the chat to the story series, the special report. It's a 6-part series that really dives in depth into how inflation is impacting the sector, from how philanthropic funding is or isn't keeping up with the inflation crisis, to how people experiencing food insecurity are weathering this time. So please, if you haven't had a chance to read that special report, please do dive into it, because it's really incredible reporting. And so welcome, Shannon. I wanted to give that sort of preamble, but I'll let you also introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about yourself and the work you do here.
Sure. I'm a news and features reporter at Future of Good. I was lucky enough to start here last August, and it's been just fantastic since then. I'm actually based in Winnipeg, so I'm coming from Treaty 1 territory, which is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Dene, the Cree, the OJ Cree, and of course the heartland of the Métis Nation. So from Winnipeg, I've covered all sorts of stories. But inflation has definitely been a big one over the last months. And I'm looking forward to hearing questions from the audience, which I may or may not be able to answer, but I will do my best. And letting you know a little bit about what I've been able to learn over the last few months.
Awesome. Thanks, Shannon. And on that note, as we go, please do introduce yourself in the chat. This event and events like this are exclusive to Future of Good members. So that means you're among great company, you're among people who are interested in a lot of the same things as you. So please do make connections in the chat and put any questions you have for us in there as well as we go, and we'll sort of bring them into the conversation as we go. And then I also have 2 questions for you, the audience, so if you're open to sharing some of your own experiences with inflation. So my 2 questions really are, how has inflation impacted your organization? And if you're open to sharing, what solutions and workarounds have you found? Let's just start talking. So Shannon, my first question for you is really around choosing what to cover. So, in a special report, it's quite in depth, but obviously there are so many different dimensions to inflation and the experiences of communities right now. So how did you narrow it down to the 6 stories that you did work on, and how did you decide what was most urgent for us to cover?
It's definitely a challenge. I mean, I could have probably kept writing about this till, the end of time immemorial. So it had to be a sort of hard deadline as to how many, we could cover. And I really wanted to start off with some broad numbers and give people a snapshot of where this was at. Because personally, I think we're all affected by inflation, and organizationally, it's just been really remarkable how deep these impacts have gone. So I wanted to share, a few numbers, and I'll just say, because I don't remember where every single number came from, but I should give a shout out to Canada Helps and Imagine Canada, also the Ontario Nonprofit Network, the Association, I believe, of Francophone nonprofit organizations, and the the Calgary Voluntary Chamber were all sources for some of the numbers I used for these stories. So just because I'm going to mess them up along the way, I wanted to give you that right off the bat. But yeah, as soon as I started digging, some of the numbers were just really shocking. One of the first ones I came across was that 60% of charities now say that demand for service has outstripped capacity. So that's just huge, and I think really tells a lot of the story. Also, 83% of small charities, and this number did come from Canada Helps, have seen increased service delivery costs. And overall, the Ontario Nonprofit Network found that even more, 88% of nonprofits of all sizes in that province found service delivery costs had increased in 2022 in particular. And in Alberta, particularly looking at disability service providers, 37% of organizations providing disability services, many on behalf of the government, actually thought their funding was at a point and their costs were at a point where they might not be able to continue. So these were just huge numbers that really told that story. And I think across the country, it's been pretty similar. I also think this number came from Canada Helps, but 65% of charities have said that they've seen donations fall. So really charities were dealing with the triple whammy. And I'm sure I don't have to tell people this, but yeah, higher costs, greater demand, and decreased donations was just sort of this trifecta. And that's where I started this coverage. And then I moved in some different areas. Food inflation, I'll talk more about that later. Also indexing grants to inflation, because how do you cover these costs? Just a lot of great areas, but really getting the overview is what I wanted to do first, because the numbers are just huge and disconcerting.
Yeah, absolutely. The numbers are really like staggering, and you can see a lot of them just in the headlines. It's like, oh my God, yeah. And I want to get into a lot of that sort of system level stuff as well later, but I also something I really love about this special report and about your work in general is that you really insist on like telling these big systemic stories through the lens of real people experiencing them. And so you have stories of people experiencing food insecurity. You have stories of people who can't afford sort of to meet their basic needs in this special report. Can you tell us, maybe share some of those stories, and then also just what was it like to hear those stories?
Yeah, I'd love to. And I have to say, I always really appreciate people who are willing to share this information with me, because often people are talking about sensitive issues, their
Yeah.
finances, how they survive day to day. And, people are very, very generous with that. One of the first folks I was able to speak to was a woman named Charisse Giesbrecht. And she was interesting because she straddled a lot of lines. She is the executive director of Moms Canada. So she works for an organization that helps single moms, but she's also a single mom herself. And it was just so illustrative. I mean, the organization used to have an office and staff, and now this one woman is running everything out of her home. And it seemed like this microcosm of what was going on writ large. And also personally, she was struggling because she was trying to, on a nonprofit salary, we'll probably talk more about that later, trying to support a family. So I was really just very, had a lot of gratitude for her for sharing that with me. But where it was most difficult to get people to share the story, but I think most impactful, was probably on food inflation. A lot of people are using food banks more than ever before. So it's out there, but finding people who want to talk to that experience is a challenge. So my main strategy was to, kind of go old school and hang out at the community fridge in Winnipeg's West End, just wait for people to come to the community fridge. And I had a lot of beautiful conversations, but not everyone wanted to go on the record. Eventually a woman who asked me to call her Bernice. I don't know if that was really the name that she was normally going by, but she was very generous with her time in the end, and talked a lot about how, she used to get help from her kids, but they were struggling to make ends meet. And, she didn't want to take, I think the phrase she used was that she wasn't going to take food away from her grandbabies. And that's a really powerful thing, to know that someone is out there checking a community fridge every day and working full time as a grandmother and not able to make ends meet and not wanting to impose on her children. And I think that really brought that home. I was also really lucky to speak to a man named John Brook. And he was just so open about how he makes ends meet, right down to, you know, the tubes of turkey he buys to get as much food as he can for the week. And that was just really eye-opening. It's one thing to know people are struggling, but it's another thing to hear how people ration their food, how they have to learn new skills, and also what they thought of food banks. You know, many people shared their thoughts on food banks with me at the community fridge, and there was such a deep dissatisfaction. So something probably for a future story, but it was really eye-opening. And then finally, on the disability and inflation front, I spoke to Victoria Levac, and she was out in Nova Scotia, so it took me to the other side of the country, virtually at least. And she was very upfront about, you know, her fears about how inflation is pushing people with disabilities towards medical assistance and dying. And it was a very blunt conversation. And her giving that insight was just invaluable, I think, to bringing home the impact that higher prices have. And it's not just about paying more and saving less. For some people, it's literally a matter of life and death. And without people being willing to share those stories, you just don't have the, you know, the gravity of that.
Yeah, absolutely. None of the work that we do would be possible without those people sharing their stories. Yeah, you sort of alluded to this at the beginning of that. But something that really sort of surprised me as we were working together on this special report is you know, when we set out to do this, I really thought we were sort of covering two distinct sides of the inflation. We are covering its effects on charities and nonprofits and its effects on the communities that they serve. And something that really surprised me, and maybe it shouldn't have, but something that did surprise me was there's a blurred line there, and increasingly people who work for charities and nonprofits are also having to access their services. So could you tell us a little bit about that? And then we can sort of get into some other things that came up that we maybe didn't expect.
Absolutely. Yeah, the line between who needs services and who provides services is really quite blurred. You know, one woman was speaking in Calgary about, even as an executive director, she was helping her staff sign up for food banks. And that really begs a lot of questions. I think everyone is aware that nonprofits jobs don't pay very well. And there was an Imagine Canada report that really laid that out. So, you know, basically someone working in the nonprofit sector is making about $18,000 less than someone working in the overall economy, which is huge. So, I mean, it's difference between making about 38,000 and, you know, I believe it was 54 or 57, depending on what sector you're in. And, you know, when groceries have gone up, you know, an extra $1,000 a year, fuel has gone up and housing has gone up, how do you make ends meet? One parallel that was drawn was the lack of volunteers, which is something I didn't expect. I mean, I think we all know that COVID decreased volunteers, but when people are working more to make ends meet, they also don't have, you know, as much time to volunteer, which puts more emphasis on staff. And it becomes this trifecta of staff doing more while not being paid more. And that really, really was laid out. As for solutions to that, you know, the number one thing I heard from people I spoke to was that they simply need more money. And a lot of that was put on funders, you know, governments or even foundations, private organizations don't fund at adequate levels. But there was also hard conversations about why nonprofits might not push for higher salaries. You know, are they being cautious because they don't want to lose funding or lose core programs? Or are they also undervaluing the work that people do? And it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. And it's definitely something that bears, you know, more discussion in the future.
Totally. Yeah, it's totally a chicken and egg thing, right? It's like charities and nonprofits are not writing in, you know, in some cases, livable wages into their grant applications. But at the same time, I think you have a quote in one of your stories from a source that's, I'm paraphrasing, but something like, you know, the sorry, I'm like losing my train of thought, but there's the funding that's available is short-term, it's project-based, and so that creates contract-based precarious work for nonprofits employees. So it's like, how do you break out of this cycle? And I think you know, a lot of this reporting is like really deepening my understanding of some of the systemic things that are happening in the sector. But yeah, how did you sort of wade through, like, where is the root of the problem here?
That, you know, is challenging. I think I would generously call it more of an exploration of the issue,
Yeah.
because there really is so many causes. But I guess if it has to be boiled down to one, you know, thing that I was consistently told is that the work is undervalued by government, by funders, even by donors, and also by the organizations themselves. I don't think it's unrelated that 77% of people who work at nonprofits are also women. I believe 47% are immigrants and 29% are considered racialized compared to 20% in the overall economy. So the fact that folks are being expected to perform unpaid labor also fall into these categories, I think speaks to very deep systemic social issues around equality, and the solutions for that are going to be complex. There's also still really the whole enthusiasm debate. I just couldn't believe how many people, you know, there's just this level of enthusiasm people are supposed to bring, and it's supposed to compensate for wages. And yes,
Mhm.
people are passionate about the work that they're doing, but you know, you can't live on passion. You can't like fuel your car with passion. And it is surprising to me that in, you know, this year and this time, we're still making that argument that you can't eat, you know, passion at the end of the day. So yeah, very complex origins, and it's going to be a very complex solution.
Yeah. And a lot of this is like, these are problems beyond inflation, right? These are sort of systemic problems beyond inflation, but sort of heightened by the situation we're in. And one of the, and you sort of alluded to like devaluing of this work by government. And one of the really stark examples of that in one of the stories was the fact that oftentimes governments will put limits on nonprofit employees' wages for services that they contract out to. They don't put the same limits on for-profit organizations that they contract out to. And I just thought that that was really shocking and just such like a stark example of some of the systemic issues that are really just being brought to light now by inflation.
For sure. It is stark. And yeah, a great example was care homes, which everyone was talking about during the pandemic. So a not-for-profit care home funded by the government will have a cap in some provinces on what they can pay people, whereas a for-profit also funded by the government to provide government services won't have a cap. And again, the undervaluing of work, and also punitive. A lot of this is very punitive. You know, it's
Mm.
almost as though government is sometimes saying, you know, if you're accessing these services, it must be through some moral failing, and we're just not prepared to fund you at the level we would fund other people at. And yeah, very complex.
Oof, that's a, yeah, that's a deep systems level thing for sure. We have a question in the chat, which is sort of taking us off course a bit here, but I think it's really interesting. Nicole asks, is there anything regarding inflation in the sector that you haven't explored yet that you want to?
Oh, that is a good question. I think housing, I haven't done anything specifically on housing, and that would be the one thing that I feel is really important. I've been covering housing for different stories and at different angles, but I've been watching some of the rents, the average rents go up, particularly in Vancouver and Toronto, and it's so astronomical. And the fallout from that, there was a story of Hamilton yesterday about a woman and her family going to Tim Hortons and having the landlord change the locks. You can read it on CBC if you want, but really that's also, you know, the fallout of inflation on housing. So yeah, that is definitely a story that I think is worth visiting, because again, it affects so many people, and it's such a complicated set of issues.
Mm-hmm. We have a couple comments in here as well. Vibhuti writes, not to mention that a lot of folks graduating out of community colleges and entering the nonprofit sector are newcomers and international students who don't have much bargaining power when it comes to finding employment. Great point. Sensetsa writes, funding also changes from political regime to another, as newly elected politicians may not want to or be able to continue with work they find started by others, and they want to have their stamp on what they would use to market themselves for re-election. Yeah, existing systems tend to reproduce themselves. Yeah, great point. Yeah, I wonder if we should maybe dive into funding, because it feels like that's sort of presented often as a solution here, but a lot of what you found through the special report, that is, it's kind of more complex than that, and we sort of touched on that a little bit. But your story on indexing grants to inflation was super interesting, and a lot of really good cases of where this has worked before. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit of that. How are foundations making this decision to index their existing grants to inflation, and how are they sort of making that work with their own priorities?
For sure. It's hard to get an overall number on how many organizations are actually doing this. So I'd love to see a survey. If anyone is listening who wants to do a nationwide poll on this, that would be great. But the two that I did speak to and who are indexing grants to inflation or providing top-ups were the McConnell Foundation and the Law Foundation of Ontario. And that wasn't a direct response to, to people they had funded. It was just so apparent that, people weren't making ends meet. So I believe the one was either 7 or 10% top up, depending on an organization's need, was offered by the McConnell Foundation, which was obviously well received. And I'm just going to actually scroll down. I've got something open to look at the number for the law. I believe the Law Foundation was a 5% top up for 25 Catalyst grant recipients, which doesn't sound maybe like a lot, but that worked out to about $650,000. So that's a lot for a foundation to put out there. And one of the things that came up while I was, speaking to different people is that there does, I think, on some level, a sense that foundations are bottomless pits, that there's no limitations, that
Right.
they're able to adjust, on a whim. But really, most foundations and philanthropic organizations are also, their fortunes are tied to inflation as much as anyone else, and changes in the market are going to diminish their ability. So as nonprofits themselves, they have a lot to consider when they're going to increase grants or top-ups or index grants to inflation. Now, as a concept of indexing grants to inflation, I think everyone is on the same page that this is a good idea, that inflation should be more fully considered, particularly when inflation is really high, or even, I like the word egregious, because it seems to really bring it home. But how this is accomplished seems to be sort of in, the infant stages. Even organizations that are providing a top up are still working on long-term plans to incorporate this. One government department I was surprised by was Global Affairs Canada, when I was talking to organizations providing international aid or international assistance or development money, and they said, yeah, we have no indexing to inflation. And that was really, really challenging for those organizations, particularly because they're working in US dollars. So I admit that I was surprised by how rare it was. I don't know if this will change it. Organizations certainly indicated they were looking at that. And the McConnell Foundation did say that they are going to overhaul some of their granting processes to better incorporate this. So that is coming. But yeah, it really, it is a challenging issue. And it's not just large foundations. One person I spoke to raised just a fascinating point, and that was, individual Canadians also don't index their giving to inflation. I mean, I'm sure we've all given the same amount over and over. I have a neighborhood charity, I give them $100 every year. I should probably increase that because $100, 10 years ago was very, very different than today. So, in some ways it seems insurmountable, but on the micro level, individual Canadians can also play a role in helping to index grants to inflation if they aren't suffering the effects of inflation themselves, of course. So, but yeah, it's a very interesting, you know, shift that I think is going to take place, or I hope takes place as a result of, the inflationary pressures that we're feeling now.
Yeah. And I think, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the sort of rationale is that to index to inflation would mean that there would be less breadth in who foundations are able to support, and even individual Canadians, right, who they're able to support. So what's sort of and you may not have the answer to this, I don't know, maybe no one has the answer to this, but what's sort of the preference for that breadth versus depth, and sort of deeply supporting a smaller number?
Yeah, that's definitely a question that foundations are asking. They're also asking that in the context of the disbursement quota.
Right.
When that increases to 5%, is that going to change granting? It does seem like as people prepare for that shift, that this is when this comes into it. But folks I spoke to, also valued healthy organizations that had the funding they needed to deliver services well. So the sense I got was that, you may see less new grants for a period as this evolves. So, not reducing the number of grantees, but maybe not adding anything new in terms of disbursement until this is settled, or until there's a better sense of how this will be handled in the future.
Totally. Yeah. Something I thought was a really good point too was that indexing to inflation, one of your sources said, indexing to inflation only really solves one half of the problem. It does not solve, it solves rising costs, or in theory covers the rising costs, but it does not solve the problem of increasing demand. And so you're sort of meeting halfway almost. But yeah, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that, and what charities and nonprofits think of that.
Sure. Yeah, that was definitely something that was raised. And one person actually raised a really interesting idea that I'd never thought of, which was indexing grants to population growth.
Mm,
And anyone who's doing a wide frontline service, why don't we, change it based on population? If a city was 15,000 10 years ago and 25,000 now, obviously, this is going to be something that should be considered. So it does, that's a great point. It does really only address half of it. And I think that maybe when we talk about inflation going forward, it would be helpful to include all these factors, and not just, the hard costs, but demand and how inflation increases demand, and also the number of people just who are generally available who may at some point access the service.
yeah. We have a question in the chat from Vibhuti again. Are you seeing, or have you explored collaborative solutions coming out of community-based organizations to be able to meet the increased demands with limited resources? In other words, examples of organizations coming together to advocate for or co-deliver programs. And I don't know if we saw much of that in the reporting, but maybe it did come up in your conversations. Is that something you saw at all?
It did come up a little bit, but not as much as I might have thought. There were some organizations who were combining roles. So instead of having a full-time accountant for one organization, maybe two or three organizations pooled together, hired the same accountant. So they had a full-time job, but didn't have the full-time burden. So that was something that did come up. Advocacy is interesting. I do feel that sometimes advocacy doesn't get the attention it needs when it comes to nonprofits. I think when everyone's in survival mode, whether it's clients or people providing services, and it's just, do we keep the lights on? Can I put food on my table? That advocacy, is collateral damage when it comes to inflation. So I didn't see as much of, advocacy for systems change as I might have thought. Now, the one exception to that was really around food insecurity, because as many people pointed out, we don't have a shortage of food, we have a shortage of money. And there was more advocacy in that area. And yeah, definitely in Toronto, I saw some groups coming together, but overall, it wasn't something that I saw a lot of, but that could be because I wasn't specifically looking for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I did notice that that came up quite a bit in a lot of the stories. And I could sort of feel you asking in your interviews, okay, what's the solution here? And then people coming back and saying policy change, systems change, advocacy. And as you say, it was very prevalent in the story on food insecurity. And it's interesting because it sort of touches on the idea of a nonprofit industrial complex. I think it was, one of your sources who said, charities should really be advocating for policies that curb the demand for their services. So that's a super interesting dynamic. Can you talk a little bit about how that plays out at a time right now when demand is so high?
Yeah, I mean, on a personal level, outside my reporting, if I have a takeaway, and I'm sure other people come to this conclusion every day as they're working in the sector, is that the problem always comes down to money. And if people were adequately funded and if the government provided basic services, a great number of charities, if not most charities, would cease to need to exist. And the great experiment that was served during the pandemic just very clearly proved that when you have a guaranteed basic income, that you solve a lot of the problems around food and housing insecurity, lack of transportation, lack of childcare, that so many charities and nonprofits work to deliver services on. And taking, it wasn't an expansive look, but social service rates, or sorry, social supports in this country and social assistance rates are very, very low. I couldn't find anyone or any province that came close to matching what CERB was, not for disability, not for anything. I think Alberta had one of the highest disability assistance rates. If you qualified for like a catastrophic injury add-on, it maybe worked out to like $18,000 a year. So in terms of systemic change and what's being advocated for, I do think that nonprofits have been equipped with this really wonderful case study that's nationwide and took place over 2 years that shows us that, people can be lifted out of poverty with adequate funding. And obviously wages are a part of that as well. So, higher wages, higher social assistance would solve really the root causes of most. Maybe money can't buy you happiness, but it can buy you groceries. And that's the starting point. When I was speaking to John Brook about his food situation, the last thing he said was, yeah, I just need more money. Like that's what the solution is. So I know the Community Food Centers of Canada, I think was the organization's name, has done a lot of advocacy around that, and really hoping for and pushing for guaranteed basic income. But yeah, there are systems level changes that when you step back, really should nonprofits be working and put themselves out of business? If we had long-term plans where that was our stated goal, it would be different. And obviously this is more philosophical, but yeah, in terms of advocacy and systems change, I think there's a lot of information that's come out of the last few years around the pandemic that could be applied to this situation with inflation and really gives us the solution if there was the political will to enact it.
Yeah. I think we talked about this in a pitch meeting a little while back, right? Where we talked about, I think we're seeing more and more organizations do advocacy based on the changes we've seen over the past few years with pandemic supports. And I think it was in the context of child poverty dropping so drastically during the pandemic, and that really having a lot to do with CERB and how a universal basic income might support that. So yeah, so for those watching, watch for a potential story in the future about how all of this changes advocacy and communications and doing that policy systems change work. So yeah, I'm wondering if we maybe should go back to this idea of what else surprised us, because I think that there was so much that I learned from this special report, and you sort of came into Future of Good and sort of immediately started covering the sector in this way. And so what really surprised you, or what did you learn about the social purpose sector through this work?
Sure. I should say that I'm actually new to the social purpose sector, longtime journalist, but this is a new beat for me. So I've probably learned lots of things that everyone else has known for a long time. But one thing I really wasn't aware of was how many government contracted services are delivered by nonprofits, particularly in the disability sector. And that was almost shocking to me that so many of these essential services the governments are really required to provide, they provide via nonprofits. And in and of itself is one thing, but with the funding models that we've already discussed, it led to just so many issues during, this really peak inflationary period. And I forget who it was who I was speaking to, but they had said, it would be like the government contracting an engineer for a new bridge and then saying, when there's a budget shortfall or there's not enough money, we'll just fundraise and then we'll open like the westbound, lanes when we get to it. And for some reason in these core services that are really important, where we're taking care of, vulnerable people, of children, of, education, we rely on this fundraising to fill gaps. And nonprofits, of course, can't pass their costs on to the consumer. They are not part of the private sector. And yeah, the great reliance that existed on really core services that were contracted through government was something I just wasn't aware of the depth of. And like I say, I'm sure everyone else on this call probably is, but it's definitely, informing, I think, some of my opinions about this. And also it gives me lots of topics to dive into in the future. So I do think that this is, a vein that's going to be mined for some time.
Hmm. Absolutely. And something we haven't really touched on head on is really like, what are the workarounds that nonprofits and charities have found? Like, how are they really adapting? And I think there was quite a bit of there was a good amount of sort of advice for nonprofits and charities in the stories from your sources. One is to sort of prioritize diversifying revenue, and the idea that in economic downturns, a lot of charities and nonprofits go for big donors, but that's really, resilience is really in diverse revenue. But so what have you found that has worked for nonprofits and charities to sort of get through this time, whether it's fundraising or whether it's adapting their services?
For sure. I mean, sadly, I think that there's fewer solutions strategies and more coping strategies.
Right.
So many organizations really said that they were at, a breaking point, and many had reduced services or paid positions had become, in some cases, volunteer positions. So that was something that I heard quite a bit. This used to be done by a staff member, and it used to be full-time, now they're part-time, or it used to be paid, now it's volunteer. So that's clearly something that's being relied on, which I think will have impacts down the road that could very well be problematic, but that was something I heard a lot of. What I touched on before was the sharing of certain skilled positions between organizations. So the example of the accountant was something that I also saw. And then also, I did see some charities come together and share positions. So the person would work part-time for two charities and they would come together and do that. Some charities also didn't want to let people go entirely. So job sharing was something that came up so that they could keep their staff. But again, staff are making less money and they're working fewer hours. So that was, I don't know if that's really like an uplifting set. Just looking, I jotted down some notes about this, and a couple things are evading me at this point. But another thing that I saw people turning to was, again, the enthusiasm and passion. And, I did speak with one executive director who was just working like 10-hour days when they used to work 8 hours. So how long is this sustainable? I don't know. Funding was the core solution. One organization, Help Bolivia, who obviously works in Bolivia, they're based in Alberta. They were trying corporate donors for the first time. So they had a lot of small donors and they were trying to diversify as was suggested. So that was something that they were doing. And a lot of small charities were really just returning to some basics. There was a lot of online auctions and other things they hadn't done for a while. Bake sales were returning. But again, are these long-term sustainable solutions? It's a lot of, band-aids and just trying to, plaster over these cracks. And you really have to, wonder where we're going to be a couple years from now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting to cover this work because it's like, it is innovation, it is resilience, but is it necessarily something to celebrate? Like, is it necessarily something to celebrate that we're in this position in the first place? So yeah, I don't know. I don't know what my question for you is, but is that something you had to navigate as you were figuring out how to report this?
It was. I mean, everyone is very proud of the work they do. People are doing
Yeah.
important work. This is holding up communities, preventing people from falling through the cracks. But there was just a level of exhaustion, I guess is how we describe it. Like people just seemed exhausted. And across all sectors, all subsectors, just there was this fatigue and burnout. That's something we haven't talked about. Burnout, I think one of the stats was 55% of people working in nonprofits in 2022 said burnout was an issue for them. And when people burn out, they leave. When I was speaking with Emmanuel Mullis, he was talking about his organization and how a lot of young people came in and they were very enthusiastic, and then they just got tired and they ended up moving on to the private sector. And maybe it says something. The private sector is where people go for respite. I mean, that's not a good feeling. Um, I mean, by and large, nonprofits are, progressive organizations who have, very, at times, lofty goals. But it doesn't always match up with what's on the ground. And how can it when you don't have enough funding and when you have people who are taking on new responsibilities, working on weekends, people that were the executive director are now also serving food. It's just, yeah, it's, I think I'm just rambling at this point, but it was intense. People were really, really tired when I spoke to them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I think it was Moms Canada that their mandate used to be primarily to provide like emotional support and mentorship to single moms, and now they are primarily referring moms to services to meet basic needs. And in some, you could say that that is like a pivot toward what's needed right now, and absolutely that's important work that has to be done. But what about the emotional support? What about the mentorship? Did you get a sense that a lot of those services that are maybe deemed non-essential but are really important are being put on hold right now?
Absolutely. And it was interesting with Moms Canada because one of the things that they provide is financial literacy training. And when is financial literacy training, most important? When you're dealing with an economic downturn. And that was one of the things that they had to put on the back burner. And it's just so important right now. So I do think that a lot of things are going to be set aside to just deal with these, short-term issues, particularly in international assistance, and the budget and the Auditor General's report recently, there's been a bit of a pivot away from the feminist international assistance policy. And it's not surprising given that there's such a panicked response in some cases to inflation and some of the present, if you're going to run out of money, you have to close a food center, you probably don't have time to do educational programming at a local school. So I think a lot of things are getting lost along the way. And we're seeing that. We're seeing the fallout from that, in our cities, in our towns, with people who are also suffering as these things that aren't just, nice to have, things that we need, but maybe they just have been cut because there's just not the capacity at this time.
Yeah. Yeah. And you sort of asked the question a few minutes ago of where will we be a few years from now if this is the reality right now? And no one has an answer to that question. I'm not expecting you to. But do you have a sense of the sort of longer term effects of this period of time on the sector, or what we might see going forward?
I mean, some organizations are clearly in the next couple of years going to cut services, and some international organizations I spoke to said they're preparing to cut staff. So I think we are going to see people lose their jobs, and as a result, programs be diminished, and services reduced. Beyond that, I mean, some folks I was speaking to in Alberta were really pushing around the importance of getting these issues, in front of voters for the next election. And the government policy, often follows voter desire. So if it's important to, the average Canadian, it will become important to government. So some folks were definitely holding out hope that there would be more emphasis on that in upcoming provincial and federal elections that would help, drive that. But I think looking at the most recent federal budget, where we didn't see almost anything for the charitable or nonprofit sector, that is going to take a lot to move that pendulum. And also municipal governments. I feel like municipal governments sometimes get a pass in all of this, but a lot of funding comes through municipal governments. And I live in downtown Winnipeg, and we see the direct cause, correlation between a pullback from funding of services and what's happening on our streets. I mean, we have record numbers of people who are unhoused right now. And it's, it's hard to see, the future, but I would hope that public pressure does mount on some of these issues. And I think in some around food and unhoused individuals, I think it is mounting. But around disability services, I don't think we're seeing the same kind of pressure that we really need to. And particularly after reading through, some of the stories of people with medical assistance and dying and the choices they're having to make, you really have to question what the future is going to bring.
Yeah. I'm just going to remind folks that we had those two questions at the beginning, if you'd like to share any of your own experiences. So one is, what is the effect of inflation on your organization, if you're open to sharing, and also what sort of workarounds have you found, if we're thinking about sort of coming together and collaborating with others in the sector. Please do share any examples you have of that. And also, if you have any questions for us, we have about 15 minutes left. So I'd love to get to some more questions from you all in the chat as well. But yeah, Shannon, my question for you really next is, what sort of unanswered questions do you have? Because, as journalists, it's super frustrating, but we can't always answer every question we have, particularly as in the context of, a 1,200, 1,500 word story. So what's still puzzling you? What's still confusing to you? What are you kind of looking for answers to moving forward?
Well, I spent a lot of time looking to the future with these stories, but I'd also would love the opportunity to look to the past. And that was something I haven't had the opportunity to do. And it may be that the data doesn't exist, and that could be one of the challenges. But obviously, we've had high inflation before, the early 80s, and then, of course, the Great Recession, 2008, 2009. And I do think it would be really interesting to compare how organizations are coping now to some of the strategies that were used in those earlier periods. Also with food banks, food banks were a development in the 80s. I think the first one was actually in Edmonton. I don't know if I'm wrong on that. And one of the responses I got to that story was people kept asking me about the Great Depression. And I said, well, we can't compare it to the Great Depression because, food banks didn't exist then. There were food, community kitchens and soup kitchens, but it was very different. So I would love to go back. And I feel that, not everything, is perfect in the past, obviously. But, there's practical solutions we may be missing, or strategies that have gone by the wayside. So yeah, reaching into the past, comparing some of those numbers, seeing how this current, financial crunch measures up, just out of curiosity's sake, I would love to know that. But I also think there's some, real things to learn out of previous bouts of inflation, and that would be something for food for thought in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this may be a bit of a tangent, but you mentioned earlier that a lot of the folks you spoke to at the community fridge were dissatisfied with food banks. And I think food banks are such an interesting example because they sort of came to be during an economic downturn, and it was really meant to be a temporary solution. It wasn't meant to be this sort of institutional long-term fixture in our society. And now here we are in 2023 in a downturn, and more people are relying on them than ever before. So yeah, so how are, based on the conversations you had, how are people experiencing food banks right now?
People, and this is mostly for the Manitoba experience, we have basically 360 food banks that are under one umbrella. So most people actually get services through Manitoba Harvest. And it covers things in the north, rural Manitoba. I think there's only a couple dozen independent food banks. But I would imagine the complaints would be similar. And the number one thing people complained about was nutrition and bread. One guy was very dramatic. He's like, I can't live on bread. It's just bread all the time. And it is. Like, I really was shocked. And the community fridge itself ended up being stocked with bread a lot. And people in that particular neighborhood, it's Winnipeg's West End, have also taken to leaving little cardboard boxes by their door with extra food. And a lot of that was also bread. So there was really, yeah, a dissatisfaction with the lack of choice. And people, there's this stigma around, I think, people who are struggling economically that they don't understand nutrition. Everyone I spoke to understood nutrition, really well. Like, they were very, very attuned to what a balanced diet should be. And they were acutely aware that what they were offered didn't allow them to eat in a way that was remotely healthy.
Hmm.
So that lack of choice and the lack of nutrition was something that just came up again and again, and also the use of gift cards, which I'm not sure exactly how prevalent it is throughout the year, but at Christmas or other holidays, gift cards have been used instead of the traditional hamper. And John Brooke had gotten a $30 gift card for Christmas, and he was like, what do I do with this? Like, how can you get Christmas dinner for $30? And there just was a real, sense that they were being denied agency. And I don't say that as a slight to the organization, but the folks I spoke to really, they expressed gratitude for having that option, but a lot of dissatisfaction. And, I understand it. I wouldn't want to be given, 6 carbohydrates either. I don't know how anyone, could really maintain a healthy diet on that. And while I didn't go in the story, John was very open in speaking to me about his struggles with his weight. And he did offer to put it in the story, but I didn't feel it added to that. And he had at one point lost 150 pounds it was during a time when he was able to buy his own food. And he had gained back 100 after, once again, relying on food bank. So the quality of life was something that was just, really, really, came out. And one person I spoke to, and again, this wasn't included, but they worked in the food security sector. They had talked about how people really need classes. More cooking classes will help. And I did raise them, like, no, I don't think cooking classes, everyone I've spoken to really has a very good understanding of what's healthy and what's not. They just don't have access to the resources. So yeah, consistent complaints. And again, probably food, no pun intended, for another story.
Yeah, and such a clear example of what we're talking about, right? Like, these services are essential. They're filling a hole for sure. But it's the systems level stuff that is ultimately the solution. Yeah, we have a question to take us sort of back to funding for a second. So Anna asks, or says, most Canadian philanthropic responses to inflation in 2022 were retroactive top-ups, which from a financial planning and operational perspective is not ideal for nonprofits or foundations. So Anna asks, what could sustainable and proactive indexing of grants to inflation look like in practice? And did you hear about any best practices on this?
That's a great question. And I wish I had a more fulsome answer, but unfortunately, I kind of have a partial answer. So some folks I spoke to had expressed a desire to have the previous year's inflation rate applied to the coming year. And that was the solution they put forward. But I wasn't aware of anyone or any organization or foundation or philanthropic foundation actually going with that. So that was something that was definitely desired and people raised. But I didn't hear any concrete solutions as that, whether or not that was actually happening.
Yeah, super interesting, this idea of retroactive versus proactive. solutions to all of this. Yeah. Shannon, is there anything that we have not touched on here that you feel is really important for people to know about when it comes to inflation, when it comes to the special report or your reporting on this?
Oh my gosh. I'm sure as soon as we end this webinar, I will think of a ton of things that will come flooding back. But I think we've covered a lot, so much that I can't remember how I started this talk. But yeah, there's nothing I think I would add at this point, except to reiterate, I really appreciate everyone who took the time to help me out with these various interviews and to share their perspectives. Not everyone that I speak to makes it into a story. Sometimes people give me time for background or, like the case of the community fridge, just taking time to talk. And yeah, without all of that generosity, I wouldn't be able to do this and share it with you at all. So yeah, I just wanted to say thanks to everyone who was so generous with their time as I worked on this.
Yeah, absolutely. Organizations are busy and stressed, and they spoke to us, and people are busy and stressed, and they spoke to us. And yeah, we are so grateful for that. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Shannon. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm sure I will think of a million other questions I wanted to ask you, and I maybe will just ask you because I can do that afterward. But thank you so much for sharing the knowledge that you've gained through this work with us. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation.
You're very welcome.
Great. Well, I'm just going to launch a poll for us here, and it's very short. It's just a feedback poll for everyone watching. It's just 2 questions. If you could just take a few seconds to answer that, that really helps us sort of plan for the next few events. And while you're doing that, I'll just let you know this event and events like it are exclusive to Future of Good members. And so if you really did like this, we'd love for you to tell your colleagues and tell your peers. We have a huge membership sale running right now. So I'm going to put a link in the chat to information about that membership sale. We have group memberships available for organizations that are interested in accessing events like this. And you can always reach us at info@futureofgood.co as well. And then the last thing that I will tell you about also is we have an event. Our next event in this series is actually a continuation of a previous event because there was so much to talk about, and that's about ChatGPT. So our CEO and publisher Vinod and our reporter Charlene are going to be in conversation about ChatGPT and really diving deeper into ethical AI and some of the regulation around it. So that's one that I know I will not want to miss, and I hope to see a lot of you there. So yeah, thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.